He stood nearly 7 feet tall, a looming silhouette etched into television history with just 2 words: "You rang." As Lurch, the eerie butler from the Addams Family, Ted Cassidy became a fixture in millions of homes. His deep voice, hollow stare, and lumbering gait striking a balance between the comically macabre and the oddly endearing. For a generation of viewers, he was unforgettable. But beyond the soundstage, behind the heavy makeup and signature groans, lived a man whose true story was seldom told, a story far more human and far more heartbreaking than the gothic caricature he portrayed. Ted Cassidy was not simply the actor who played Lurch. He was a gifted student, an accomplished athlete, a radio broadcaster, a musician, and a devoted father. He was also a man shaped by struggle, both physical and emotional. His towering frame, which had once made him the target of childhood bullying, later became the defining factor of his career in Hollywood. Directors saw his height, his voice, and his peculiar features and cast him not as a man, but as a spectacle, the monster, the alien, the brute. Rarely was he offered a role that allowed him to express the depth and intelligence he possessed in abundance. And yet, Ted Cassidy never stopped searching. He searched for belonging, for creative fulfillment, for recognition beyond the surface. His life was marked by reinvention, from a shy boy in Pittsburgh to a college basketball star, from a local Dallas DJ to a national television icon. Along the way, he lived through moments of joy and triumph, but also through persistent typecasting, private medical struggles, and an unrelenting sense of being misunderstood. Even when he became a household name, he remained quietly aware that the role which made him famous had also confined him. This is the story of Ted Cassidy, not just the actor behind Lurch, but the man whose life echoed with both laughter and loneliness. In the chapters ahead, we'll trace his journey through the golden age of television, explore the legacy he left behind, and examine the challenges he faced off-screen, from the painful realities of acromegaly to the emotional weight of a career that never quite matched his ambition. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, Ted Cassidy's shadow still lingers. It's time to see him not as a character, but as a man. The one behind the voice, the one behind the mask, the one you may not have truly known until now. Long before the towering figure of Lurch haunted the halls of television's most peculiar mansion, Ted Cassidy was simply a boy growing up in Pittsburgh, brilliant, awkward, and already set apart by nature. From an early age, Ted stood taller than his classmates, both intellectually and physically. He entered high school years ahead of schedule, a quiet prodigy with a voracious appetite for learning. While most boys his age were still fumbling through adolescence, Ted was solving complex problems, reading voraciously, and dreaming of something larger than the steel town that surrounded him. But height, especially the kind that draws second glances, comes with its own burden. By the time he was 14, Ted had already grown to 6'1", a height that many men don't reach in adulthood. His body stretched long before his confidence could catch up. In hallways and locker rooms, his towering presence made him a natural target for teasing. Students whispered, strangers stared, and though he tried to blend in, there was simply no hiding someone like Ted Cassidy. Yet what could have broken another child instead became his quiet fuel. He channeled the sting of isolation into ambition, applying himself with relentless determination. On the basketball court, he learned how to use his frame as a strength rather than a liability. He joined the football team, where for once his size was celebrated rather than mocked. Still, the sense of being different never left him. He was often the youngest in the room, the tallest in the group, and the loneliest at heart. Despite the emotional toll, Cassidy's teenage years laid the foundation for the man he would become. He developed a deep inner resilience, the kind forged in silence, not spotlight. He moved through those years with grace and discipline, rarely complaining, always striving. Beneath the growing pains and the unwanted attention was a young man who already knew how to carry weight, both physical and emotional. He didn't have the charm of a matinee idol or the easy confidence of a class clown. But what he did have, intellect, work ethic, and a quiet strength, would one day become the core of his most unforgettable roles. Even if the world hadn't yet noticed, Ted Cassidy was already learning how to play characters larger than life, because in many ways he had no other choice. When Ted Cassidy stepped onto the campus of West Virginia Wesleyan College, he found something he had long been without: community. After years of standing out for all the wrong reasons, he was finally entering a chapter where his height, his talents, and his mind could coexist without conflict. College offered a clean slate, an escape from the teasing of adolescence and the narrow judgments that had so often followed him. Academically, Ted was as gifted as ever. But it was on the basketball court where he truly came into his own. He played center, commanding the paint with quiet authority, turning what had once been the source of so much discomfort, his height, into a distinct advantage. It was the first time in his life that his physical stature was viewed not with suspicion or ridicule, but with admiration. His presence became an asset, and in return, he poured himself into the sport with discipline and determination. But college was more than just athletics. Ted joined the Alpha Sigma Phi fraternity, a gesture that may seem small from the outside, but marked a turning point for him. For the first time, he was surrounded by peers who accepted him for who he was, rather than what he looked like. In the company of these young men, he discovered a sense of belonging, the warmth of brotherhood, and the simple comfort of being seen as an equal. Eventually, he transferred to Stetson University in Central Florida, where he would continue both his academic and athletic journey. At Stetson, he excelled as a basketball player, averaging impressive numbers over 3 seasons. Off the court, he became deeply involved in campus life, serving in student government, engaging in community service, and even joining the Ormond Beach Life-Saving Corps. During summers, he worked as a lifeguard along the Daytona and Ormond beaches, a role that placed him quite literally in the sun, far from the shadows he had once known. These years were not just about building a resume. They were about discovering identity. For the first time, Ted was beginning to feel comfortable in his own skin. The awkward, self-conscious teenager was maturing into a man of presence, not because he had shed his differences, but because he had started to own them. In many ways, college was Ted Cassidy's first real taste of what it felt like to be accepted without conditions. It would be a fleeting feeling, one that fame would later distort and complicate, but in those sun-drenched years of camaraderie, sport, and scholarship, Ted found something he would forever carry with him. The belief that he was more than a physical type. He was simply someone worth knowing. With his degree in speech and drama freshly earned, Ted Cassidy stepped into adulthood with a quiet sense of purpose. In 1956, he married his college sweetheart, Margaret Helen, and the couple soon relocated to Dallas, Texas. Far from the glamour of Hollywood, Dallas was where Ted would first test the waters of a public career. Not through acting, but through his unmistakable voice. He found his start in radio, securing a midday slot at WFAM. His deep, resonant tone stood out instantly. Even in a field full of broadcasters, Ted's voice cut through, steady, commanding, unforgettable. Listeners leaned in. Producers took notice. And while his height was invisible over the airwaves, the presence he projected through sound alone was magnetic. Television soon followed. Ted landed a quirky on-screen role as Creech the Alien on Dialing for Dollars, a local film showcase with a sci-fi twist. Dressed in outlandish makeup, he delivered oddball antics and monologues that hinted at the kind of genre roles he would later become known for. It was a modest production, but for Ted, it was his first taste of what it meant to hold an audience visually as well as vocally. It wasn't Shakespeare, but it was a start. Then came one of the strangest twists of fate in his early career. On November 22, 1963, Ted was in the WFAA studios when news broke that President John F. Kennedy had been shot just blocks away in Dealey Plaza. Cassidy was one of the first broadcasters on the scene, interviewing 2 key eyewitnesses, W.E. Newman Jr. and his wife, Gail, who had stood mere feet from the motorcade. The gravity of the moment wasn't lost on Ted. Beneath the makeup and the booming voice was a man deeply aware of the times he was living in and the responsibility of bearing witness. Yet even with this brush with national history, Ted's path remained humble. Outside of radio and TV, he played organ at a local Dallas cafe, showcasing his musical talents. He continued working as a lifeguard at Ormond Beach during the summers, always returning to the water that had once brought him peace. And at home, his family was growing. First a son, Sean, then a daughter, Cameron. There was no glamour in those years, no stardom or red carpets. But there was a quiet dignity in the way Ted Cassidy built his life. Layer by layer, voice by voice, note by note. He was becoming a man of many talents, even if the world hadn't fully recognized them yet. What he lacked in fame, he made up for in devotion to his craft, to his family, and to the dream that still flickered quietly within him. Next would come the break he had been waiting for. But like so much in Ted's life, it would arrive in a form both unexpected and bittersweet. In 1964, Hollywood finally came knocking. The role on paper was simple, a towering, silent butler in a macabre new sitcom called The Addams Family. It was based on Charles Addams' eccentric cartoons and promised a strange blend of gothic humor and suburban satire. Producers were seeking someone physically imposing, an actor who could make a room fall silent with a glance. Ted Cassidy, at 6'9" with a voice that rumbled like distant thunder, fit the part effortlessly. But it wasn't just his height that won him the role. In his audition, Cassidy ad-libbed a single line, "You rang," delivered with a dry, almost mournful tone that caught the producers off guard. It hadn't been scripted, but the line landed so perfectly that it became Lurch's trademark. That subtle piece of improvisation captured the character's charm. Haunting, yes, but also oddly lovable. Originally, Lurch was not supposed to speak at all. He was intended to loom silently in the background, a figure of menace and mystery. But once Cassidy delivered that now famous phrase, the character evolved. Groans, sighs, and deep-chested grumbles became his language. With little dialogue, Ted managed to give Lurch a soul, one that was equal parts Frankenstein and forlorn gentleman. The show was an instant success. Cassidy's portrayal of Lurch stood out not just for its visual impact, but for its emotional undertones. Behind the blank stares and deadpan delivery was a subtle humor and unexpected tenderness. He didn't just play the role, he inhabited it, lending nuance to a character that could have easily become a cartoonish footnote. And there was more than just Lurch. In a lesser-known contribution, Cassidy also lent his hand, literally, to the character of Thing, the disembodied appendage that scurried across tables and opened doors. While Lurch expressed himself through grunts, Thing communicated through gesture. Ted's ability to give both roles life with minimal movement was a testament to his physical control and performance instincts. Though Lurch became his signature role, it was also a double-edged sword. The fame was immediate, but so was the box he found himself in. Casting directors now saw him as the giant, the oddity, the heavy. But in the moment, Cassidy leaned into the success. He reprised Lurch for a Batman episode in 1966, lent his voice to the animated Addams Family series in the early 1970s, and even appeared as Lurch in crossover episodes with Scooby-Doo. The world finally knew Ted Cassidy's name, even if it was mostly whispered in haunted tones, trailing after the echo of a now immortal phrase. He had reached the heights of television fame, but behind the scenes, a different feeling was beginning to stir. The very thing that launched his career was also threatening to define it, and for a man of his talent, that realization would soon cast a long shadow. While the Addams Family had cemented Ted Cassidy in the public imagination, it also quietly opened the door to a realm where his physical appearance mattered less, and his immense vocal power could finally take center stage: voice acting. In animation and science fiction, Cassidy found a new creative freedom, one where his voice, not his towering frame, defined the character. His first major leap into this world came with Star Trek, where he voiced the Gorn, a towering reptilian alien who famously battled Captain Kirk in one of the series' most enduring episodes. With a snarl, a growl, and guttural menace, Cassidy turned a man in a rubber suit into a truly fearsome creature. It was the kind of role that few could have elevated beyond its costume, but Ted's deep, primal tones lent it unforgettable weight. The success of that performance led to even more voice work. Cassidy soon became the new voice of Ben Grimm, better known as The Thing, for the animated Fantastic Four reboot in 1978. Taking over from the legendary Paul Frees, Cassidy gave the character a gravelly charm, equal parts brawn and heart. And his range didn't stop there. In Super Friends, he voiced iconic villains like Brainiac and Black Manta, two characters as distinct in tone as they were in temperament. Cassidy knew how to modulate, how to breathe life into even the simplest of lines, making each one resonate. In the 1979 Godzilla cartoon, Cassidy provided the thunderous roars and monstrous sounds that brought the giant lizard to life. And though it was far from Shakespeare, these roles allowed Ted to reach audiences in ways that transcended his physical type. His voice, already so distinct, had become his ticket to reinvention. Perhaps one of his most unheralded contributions came on the Incredible Hulk television series. While Lou Ferrigno portrayed the green-skinned creature in muscle and makeup, it was Cassidy's deep narration that set the tone for each episode. His voice introduced viewers to the tortured duality of Dr. Banner's existence, adding gravitas to a show built on emotion as much as action. He also lent the Hulk his monstrous growls during transformation scenes, turning Cassidy into the unseen but ever-present heartbeat of the series. Commercials soon followed. Cassidy's voice, commanding yet strangely soothing, became a staple across media, selling products, narrating documentaries, and giving authority to whatever message needed to be delivered. For once, he wasn't just the tall man in the corner. He was the storyteller, the narrator, the voice that lingered in the mind. In the world of animation and science fiction, Ted Cassidy was finally unbound. No longer limited to how he looked, he could now inhabit characters of all shapes, sizes, and worlds. He had found a stage where he could stretch creatively, a quiet redemption, perhaps, for the roles he had been denied on screen. Yet even this success carried a familiar undertone. The voice was powerful, but the man behind it still longed for more. For all the range Ted Cassidy had shown, on radio, in animation, and even in brief glimpses of dramatic potential, Hollywood, it seemed, only ever saw the same thing. The height, the voice, the figure built for menace. And no matter how far his talent stretched, the roles did not. He was cast again and again as the brute, the oaf, the lumbering oddity who frightened or amused, but rarely spoke from the heart. It was a pattern he recognized early, and one that wore on him deeply. Cassidy was not unaware of his uniqueness. He often joked that there weren't many 6'9" actors walking around Hollywood, and he knew full well that his presence was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it got him in the door. On the other, it kept him in a cage. No matter how much emotion he poured into a role, the characters were almost always one-dimensional, crafted to showcase his size, not his soul. In a candid 1978 interview, Cassidy expressed his growing disillusionment. "They always make fellows like me the big dumb galoot," he said. "The oaf who doesn't know anything, who trips over himself." His voice, so often used to intimidate on screen, now carried frustration and sorrow. He wasn't angry at the producers or the audience. He was disappointed in the system. A system that valued novelty over nuance, appearance over ability. The frustration ran deeper than missed opportunities. Being cast as monsters and henchmen brought back painful memories of his youth. Those school hallways where his height made him a target. Back then, he had believed success would wash those memories away. But now, years into his steady career, he found himself playing the same role over and over, as though the teasing had simply shifted from classmates to casting agents. He spoke openly about not feeling proud of many of the roles he had played. Not because he disliked the work, but because he knew what he was capable of. He longed for a part with depth, a chance to play a character whose complexity matched his own. But that chance never came. Instead, he leaned on the kindness of directors and producers who had once worked with him, those willing to offer him another job, even if it was more of the same. He was, in his own words, trying to avoid the welfare line. It was a stark reminder of how precarious even a visible career in Hollywood could be, especially for someone boxed in by something as unchangeable as their appearance. And yet, Cassidy kept showing up, kept lending his voice, his presence, his professionalism. He didn't quit. But the weight of being seen as nothing more than a spectacle, year after year, left a quiet sadness that never quite lifted. For all the recognition he had received, it was never the kind he truly wanted. Hollywood had given him a stage, but it refused to let him speak freely upon it. Beneath the looming shadow Ted Cassidy cast on screen was a physical reality few understood. One shaped not just by genetics, but by a rare medical condition called acromegaly. Like fellow actors Richard Kiel and Andre the Giant, Cassidy lived with the effects of excessive growth hormone production, a disorder that had begun early in life and quietly shaped nearly every aspect of his body and being. Acromegaly explained much: his extraordinary height, the pronounced features of his face, the enlarged hands and feet. But the condition was more than just visible difference. It came with internal battles, joint pain, arthritis, heart complications, and a persistent sense of discomfort that often went unspoken. For Cassidy, this wasn't just an actor's burden, it was a human one. Each lumbering step, as Lurch, every slow turn of the head, may have seemed part of the performance, but often it was also a reflection of real pain. His walk, deliberate, heavy, almost haunting, became part of Lurch's identity. But some observers, including medical experts, later suggested that the stiffness may have been caused in part by arthritis, a common and debilitating companion to acromegaly. What audiences saw as stylized movement may have in fact been the body's quiet resistance. And yet, Cassidy rarely spoke publicly about the condition. In an era when physical difference was often a subject of spectacle rather than compassion, he chose dignity and privacy. But those close to him knew the toll it took. Not just the aching joints or medical concerns, but the way the condition altered how he was seen. As the bones continued to grow, as the features became more pronounced, he faced the painful challenge of recognizing himself less and less in the mirror. For many with acromegaly, that shifting reflection can lead to a deep sense of alienation from oneself and from the world. In 2022, long after Cassidy's passing, the largest ever gathering of people with acromegaly was held, an event that shed light on the emotional toll of the disorder. Jill Sisko, president of the acromegaly community, spoke of how the condition impacts more than appearance. It shapes identity, self-esteem, and the simple ability to be seen without judgment. In many ways, Ted Cassidy had lived through all of it before the language and awareness around it truly existed. Behind the makeup and costumes, there was always more than Lurch. There was a man navigating a changing body, managing pain, and enduring public misunderstanding with grace. His physical uniqueness, which had brought him fame, was the very thing that made day-to-day life more difficult. And yet, he never used it as an excuse. He showed up, delivered his lines, played his roles, and endured the toll in silence. Acromegaly shaped the outline of Ted Cassidy's life, but it never defined his spirit. He lived not as a victim of circumstance, but as a man who bore his challenges with quiet resolve, a quality more powerful than any performance. As the 1970s wore on, Ted Cassidy found himself in a period of quiet reckoning. His career had reached a steady rhythm. Voice roles came regularly, and guest appearances on television kept him working. But the breakthrough part he had always longed for still eluded him. More than a decade after the Addams Family had first aired, Cassidy remained, in the eyes of the industry, the same. The deep-voiced giant, useful for certain roles, but rarely considered for anything more profound. At home, things were shifting too. His marriage to Margaret Helen, the woman he had once built a life with in Dallas, came to an end in 1975. The reasons were never widely publicized, but friends noted the strain of Cassidy's internal frustrations, his dissatisfaction with typecasting, his private health battles, his growing desire for something more meaningful. Divorce marked the closing of a chapter he had once held dear, and though he remained devoted to his two children, the parting left a quiet sadness in its wake. More seriously, Cassidy's health was beginning to deteriorate. Like many living with acromegaly or gigantism, he had developed cardiovascular complications. Years of strain on his heart had begun to manifest, and in 1978, doctors discovered a tumor, non-malignant, but dangerously positioned around his heart. It was a development he met with quiet pragmatism. Surgery, while risky, seemed the only option. In January of 1979, Ted underwent open-heart surgery to remove the tumor. Initially, the procedure appeared successful. He returned home to recover, surrounded by loved ones, hopeful that he would regain his strength. But just days later, complications arose. He was rushed back to the hospital, and on January 6, 1979, Ted Cassidy passed away. He was only 46 years old. The loss was sudden, and for those who knew him well, deeply personal. John Astin, his friend and Addams Family co-star, recalled in a later interview that Cassidy's children had called him in those final days, hoping that the sound of his voice might bring Ted back to consciousness. Astin visited his old friend at the hospital the night before he died. It was a quiet farewell, one rooted in years of collaboration, laughter, and mutual respect. In accordance with his wishes, Cassidy's ashes were scattered in the backyard of his Woodland Hills home, a modest ranch-style residence tucked among trees and quiet streets. It wasn't the house of a Hollywood tycoon, but of a man who found comfort in simplicity. He had lived a life of steady work, quiet integrity, and deep personal complexity. His children, Sean and Cameron, went on to become attorneys, each following their own path, each shaped by the quiet strength their father had modeled. Ted Cassidy did not leave behind a vast estate or a wall full of awards, but he left behind something far more enduring, a legacy of resilience, of talent underappreciated, and of a character who still looms large in the memory of generations. In a town that often measures success by marquee names and headline roles, Ted Cassidy carved a different path. His face, voice, and presence linger in memory not because they were constantly in the spotlight, but because they left a mark, haunting, soulful, and undeniably unique. He was the quiet giant behind 1,000 performances, a man whose talents were often concealed beneath makeup, prosthetics, or studio sound, but who nevertheless gave each role the full measure of his heart. Though the Addams Family defined him in the eyes of the public, Cassidy was never content to be remembered for one part. He yearned for complexity, for characters that reflected the intelligence and inner life he so carefully guarded. And yet, even as Hollywood confined him to a narrow box, he continued to work, to adapt, and to offer his gifts wherever they would be accepted, on airwaves in animation studios behind closed recording booths. He found in voice acting what he had long been denied on screen, the chance to be anything. His life was not without its shadows. Typecasting, health challenges, the emotional toll of living with a condition that set him apart at every turn. These were real and lasting burdens. But they did not define him. What did was his perseverance. He endured with grace, showed up with professionalism, and brought dimension to roles that others might have dismissed as simple. Ted Cassidy died young, just 46 years old, still seeking the role that would reflect all he had to offer. But in a sense, he played that role all along, not on camera, but in life. The role of a father, a friend, a thoughtful artist who carried both dignity and pain with quiet strength. His children remember him not as Lurch, but as the man who played piano, who told stories, who was kind. His peers remember a collaborator who gave generously and expected little in return. Today, Cassidy's image continues to flicker across television screens. His voice still echoes in Saturday morning reruns, and his legacy endures in the many characters he helped bring to life. He may not have received the credit he deserved in his time, but for those who look closer, his story is more than a footnote in television history. It is a reminder of how easily Hollywood can overlook depth in favor of spectacle. Ted Cassidy's was a quiet legacy, but sometimes it is the quietest voices, those delivered in a low, measured baritone, that linger the longest. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories of Hollywood's golden era.